Welcome back. So, we were discussing about the carrying value of a bond. Let us read it out. At dates between the purchase and the sale, the value of a bond at the same YTM as when it was purchased is its carrying value. Then we started talking about this example at t equal to 0, X invests in the issue of 10% bonds. The coupon rate is 10%, they are annual bonds. That means they pay coupon at the end of each year for 5 years. The life of the bond is 5 years. We assume that the bonds are redeemable at par value of 1000. The maturity is 5 years, as I just mentioned. The market interest rates at the point of issue, that is at t equal to 0, are 12%. So, we need to work out the issue price and the carrying value at the end of each year. We then proceeded to work out the issue price, and we did so by discounting the coupon payments and the redemption value at the then prevailing interest rate, which was 12%, and we arrived at 928. So, the bond would be sold at a discount of 72 INR per 1000 of face value, and it would be taken up by the public. The public or the investors would be willing to take up this bond not at 1000, but at 928. The value of the bond at the end of the first year, let us investigate the accounting at the inputs at the end of the first year. The first year return will now be calculated for the investor on 928, which is his actual cash outflow, and he wants a return of 12%. So, the return to the investor will be 111.36, that is 12% of 928. Out of this, he will receive 100 in terms of the coupon payments, and because it is a 10% coupon bond and 10% on a face value of 1000 translates to 100. So, he gets 100 as cash on account of return on the bond in the first year or at the end of the first year, and there is an amortization of 11.36 in the discount. In other words, the value of the bond, the carrying value of the bond appreciates by 11.36, and this appreciation also constitutes a return to the investor. His total return now is 111.36, which works out to 12% on his investment of 928. So, I repeat, the return to the investor at the end of the first year will comprise of two parts. Number 1, the coupon payment of 100, and number 2, the amortization of discount, that is the value of his investment would increase in the books from 928 by 11.36, and it would come up to 939.36. So, this is the new value. This is called the carrying value of the investment. We can also work out the carrying value by discounting the future cash flows from the bond at the end of the first year. After he receives the coupon at the end of the first year, the remaining cash flows would be the coupon payments at the end of the second year, third year, fourth year and fifth year, and the redemption of principals. If you discount all these cash flows at 12%, you again arrive at the same value, which is 939.36. So, this 939.36 constitutes the carrying value of the bond at the end of the first year. I repeat, at the end of the first year. Obviously, the carrying value will change as the discount gets more and more amortized. The carrying value will increase until it converges to the par value or the redemption value on the date of maturity of the bond. The carrying value is tabulated in this particular chart. At the end of the first year, the carrying value is 939.36. At the end of the second year, it is 952.08 and so on, and the amount of amortization is given in the last column. In the first year, as we worked it out, it was 11.36. For the second year, it is 12.72, third year 14.25, 15.96 in the fourth year and 17.88 in the fifth year. So, at the end of the fifth year, if you look at the carrying value, it becomes equal to the redemption value, which is as it should be. These two slides constitute the accounting procedures in respect of this particular bond. I leave it for the information of the learners to study it at their convenience. Now, we talk about the bond equivalent yield. Now, as I mentioned much earlier on, that in India as well as in the US, the payments of coupons are semi-annual in most cases. At least in the case of government treasuries, government T-bonds that are issued by the government, the central government, and the coupons on their own are paid at intervals of 6 months. So, how do we work out the annualized yield or annual return? How do we quote the annualized return on these instruments? This is called the bond equivalent yield. Now, to work out the bond equivalent yield, what we do is we work out the yield for assuming a time period to be of 6 months. Therefore, on the basis of the coupon rate, that is, we half the coupon rate and using the current market price and double the number of periods for number of years for which the bond is issued. Let me illustrate by an example. Let us say again you have a 10% government bond which pays you has a face value of 1000 and which pays coupons and redemption up to 5 years. That is, the life of the bond is 5 years. We want to work out the bond equivalent yield of this instrument. Let us assume that the current market price of the bond is say 960. What we do is we equate the current market price 960 equal to the discounted value of each coupon, where the coupon is worked out at half the rate. So, each coupon would be at 5% of 1000, that is, each coupon value would be of 50 and the number of discounting periods would not be 5 years now, it would be 10 half years. So, the required equation that we have to solve is 960 is equal to summation of t equal to 1 to 10 of 50 divided by 1 plus y y to the power t. Whatever value of y we get in this equation, we simply double this value and we get the bond equivalent yield. So, that is how the bond equivalent yield is quoted on an annualized basis. What is the relation between the bond equivalent yield and the effective annual yield? Well, that is given on this slide. We simply half out the bond equivalent yield and then square it to arrive at the relationship between the effective yield and the bond equivalent yield. Of course, we subtract 1 to normalize the yield. Let us take an example to illustrate what I have just mentioned. Consider a bond that pays a semi-annual coupon of 50 over its next 2 years. Semi-annual coupon of 50 over the next 2 years. It is being quoted at 1075, face value is 1000. Calculate the bond equivalent yield and the effective annual yield. Well, the process is simple. We solve this equation as I mentioned just now. The price of the bond on the left hand side, on the right hand side we calculate the discounted value of the coupons over the number of half years over which the coupons would be paid. So, in this case the number of half years is how much? It is over the next 2 years. So, it would be 4. So, the summation would be over the 4 years and then at the end of the coupon payments you get the redemption of the principal, which is discounted back to 0 using the same process. The effective annual yield can then be calculated by IE or RY is equal to 1 plus Y bond equivalent yield divided by 2 whole square minus 1. So, this is how the bond equivalent yield is calculated. Let me repeat once again, we half the coupon rate multiplied by the face value, we get the coupon payment at the end of each half year. We discount all these coupon payments assuming the half year periods as units of time instead of the full year periods as unit of time. In other words, we double the number of periods number of years for which the bond exists, and we also of course discount the face value of the bond, the redemption value of the bond similarly, and on the basis of the discount rate which equates the current market price to the discounted value of the coupons and the redemption value, we arrive at the half yearly YTM, we double this half yearly YTM and we get the bond equivalent yield. Now, we come to the important measure which is also called the effective annual yield, but which is more commonly known as the annualized holding period yield or annualized realized yield. But before we get to that, let us talk about the holding period yield. Now, the holding period yield is the yield that is actually earned or projected to be earned by the investor on his investment based on his perception. So, contrary to what we have for the YTM, this yield relaxes the assumptions of the YTM. What are the assumptions of YTM? The reinvestment rate is equal to the YTM by default, and the investor holds the bond up to maturity. We relax both of these assumptions. We now have an explicit estimate. We input an explicit estimate for the reinvestment rate, and we also use the actual holding period or the projected holding period, which may not equal the maturity of the instrument. It may be less than the maturity of the instrument, depending on how long is the investment horizon of the investor. So, obviously, this particular yield, the holding period yield, would depend on the reinvestment rate, and that is inputted, that is estimated by the investor, as well as the holding period that is desired by the investor. So, both the assumptions that went into the YTM are now relaxed. Let us see what is the cost that we pay for relaxing these assumptions. Obviously, before we go forward, the holding period yield may be quoted or may be stated at the per se basis, that is for the actual holding period. If you are holding the bond for 2 years, you quote the return for 2 years, and on the basis of which you quote the 2-year holding period yield, or which is more common is to annualize the yield and then quote it on an annualized basis. So, that is the annualized holding period yield, which is equal to the effective annual yield as well. Now, as I mentioned just now, the holding period yield assumes a holding period, inputs an holding period as per the requirements of the investor. It assumes a reinvestment rate spectrum, which is again estimated by the analyst or the investor, and it also, because now there is another very important point. Now, because the bond is not going to be held up to maturity, we do not explicitly know, or it is not a part of the contract at least, that what is the value at which the bond would be sold in the market and the investor would exit the investment. Let me repeat, if the bond was to be held to maturity, the redemption value of the investment or the exit value of the investment would be equal to the value that is given in the contract of issue. But if you exit the investment before the maturity of the bond, then you have to exit the investment by selling the investment in the market, selling the bond in the market, and that is the reason, or at this point the randomness creeps in, and you have to estimate the market price that would be available to you for exiting the investment when you work out a projected holding period yield. Of course, if it's an actual holding period yield, you know the actual price at which you exited the investment, so there is no ambiguity. But if you are trying to project a holding period yield on the basis of your estimates, you also need to estimate the market price at which you will exit the investment. Now, this is the formula for the holding period yield, not annualized, per se holding period yield. P0 is the market price, the entry price at which you entered the investment, at which you made the investment, into 1 plus HPY, that is the holding period yield, is equal to the total cash flows. Now, what will be the total cash flows? The total proceeds of the reinvested coupons plus the price at which you exit the investment, the selling price of the investment. And if you want to annualize this holding period yield, you simply use this formula P0 into 1 plus RY, where RY is the annualized holding period yield to the power H, where H is the holding period, and this equals the total cash flows from the investment, which, as I mentioned just now, are equal to the proceeds of the reinvested coupons and the value at which you exit the investment, the selling price of the investment or the bond. And let us do an example. A portfolio manager has an investment horizon of 3 years. A portfolio manager has an investment horizon of 3 years. He can either purchase a 15% Government of India bond due in 3 years, or a 15% Government of India bond due in 7 years, that would be sold at the end of the 3 years at the end of its investment horizon. Both bonds have a face value of 1000 and are quoted at par, and we assume that the coupon rates are annual. Coupon payments are annual for simplicity of exposition. Now, interest rates are expected. Now, this is the important part. The interest rates are expected to make a single downward change at the end of year 2, and the market yield would dip from 15% to 10% up to year 7. So, for 2 years the market interest rates would remain at their present value of how much? Of 15%. How do I get 15%? Because the bonds are being quoted at par and they are 15% bonds. So, clearly the market rates have to equal the coupon rates. So, the current interest rates are 15%, and at the end of 2 years the interest rates would change from 15% to 10%. That is a projection that is made by the investor. The investor's holding period is 3 years. Let us assume that we do not know much about the technicalities of this question. Let us try to figure out an answer on which bond is better on the basis of simple layman's attempt. Let us see. Now, what we have is the two bonds are pretty similar in terms of coupons. So, the coupons that they would receive at the end of the first year, second year and third year would be the same in terms of value. They would each be equal to 150. So, the issue now comes back to or ends up in being which of the two bonds will command a higher price on the date of exiting of the investment at the end of the holding period. Let us look at the first bond, bond A. Now, bond A is a par bond, obviously a level coupon bond, again we make that assumption, redeemable at par. So, because its remaining life is 3 years, so it would be quoting at 1000 at the end of 3 years. In other words, when you redeem the bond, you get 1000 rupees, 1000 INR, that is as far as bond A is concerned. The redemption value or the exit value of the investment in the case of A is equal to 1000. Let us work out the exit value of B. Now, what he says is that in the case of bond B, the or rather in the case of the interest rates, as far as the interest rates are concerned, the interest rates will make a downward shift at the end of year 2 from the currently prevailing 15% to 10%. Now, if the interest rates make a downward shift, what would happen to the price of the bonds? The price of the bonds would increase. Now, how do we work it out? How do we actually work out the price? Let us say we want to work out the price of the bond B at the end of the 3-year holding period, 3-year investment horizon of the investor. That would simply be equal to the present value of all future cash flows, all the remaining cash flows. What are the remaining cash flows? The coupon payment at the end of year 4, coupon payment at the end of year 5, coupon payment at the end of year 6, coupon payment at the end of year 7, and the redemption proceeds at par at the end of year 7 for bond B. All these cash flows at the end of the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th years of 150 at 4, 5, 6 and 1150 at 7 would be discounted at the now prevailing interest rate, which is 10%. Clearly, you will get a figure which is greater than 1000. So, what does it imply? It implies that if you sell the bond B in the market at the end of 3 years, you get a return, you get a price which is higher than the face value of the bond. However, as far as the bond A is concerned, because the investment horizon is coinciding with the life of the bond, you will simply get the redemption value of 1000. So, clearly without any analysis, we can infer that the bond B is going to give you a higher realized yield or annualized realized yield compared to the bond A over your holding period. This is the procedure which technically you should proceed, but I prefer to bring to you the analysis on the common sense basis since it is more educative. Now, properties of annualized holding period yield. The annualized holding period yield will always lie between the YTM and the reinvestment rate. For bonds with longer term to maturity, the realized yield will be closer to the reinvestment rate. For bonds with smaller or shorter terms to maturity, the bonds would be the realized yield would be closer to the YTM of the bond. Let me repeat, for bonds with longer term to maturity, a longer period of time remaining, more coupon payments remaining, the annualized holding period, or I am sorry, annualized holding period yield would be closer to the reinvestment rate. And for bonds which have a shorter period to maturity, which have lesser coupon payments remaining, the annualized holding period yield would be closer to the YTM. The proof is quite simple. Again, a simple algebra here. What we find is here in this particular expression, if we assume that r is greater than y, if r is greater than y, what is r? Let me explain. R is the reinvestment rate, y is the YTM. So, if r is greater than y, which we make the assumption that reinvestment rate is greater than the YTM, then what we find is that the right hand side is positive. If the right hand side is positive, then the left hand side also needs to be positive, and therefore, the realized yield will also be greater than the YTM. Therefore, one thing we have inferred that if r is greater than y, if the reinvestment rate is greater than y, the realized yield is greater than YTM. What remains to be shown is that the realized yield would be less than the reinvestment rate. Let us see on this second slide. In this expression, if you look at the expression on the right hand side, the expression that I have put within square brackets, if r were replaced by y, the expression within the square brackets would be equal to P0 from the definition of YTM, since it is the present value of all future coupons as well as the present value of the face value or the redemption value. So, this would, if the discount rate was YTM, then this present value must be equal to the current market price by the definition of YTM. Now, we are assuming that r is greater than y. Now, because r is greater than y, the figure that will end up here in the right hand side in the box must be less than P0, because the interest rates and the price are inversely related. So, if you are taking a value of the interest rate, a discount rate which is higher than y, then you will end up with a price or the left hand side figure which is greater than P0. I am sorry, which is less than P0. If you use y here for discounting, if you use y, then what you end up is the price. If you use any discount rate which is greater than y, then what you end up is a figure which is less than P0. Conversely, if you use a r which is less than y, the output that you get is greater than P0. So, because we are assuming that r is greater than y, the expression on this right hand side is less than P0, and therefore, we get ry is less than r. So, we have now established that if r is greater than y, then r is greater than ry is greater than y. In other words, the realized yield is sandwiched between the reinvestment rate and the YTM as mentioned in the properties. So, yield to call, but before we talk about yield to call, let us understand what we mean by a callability option embedded in the bond. Now, it may so happen that the issuer of the bond has a perception that the interest rates may change to his favor, that is, the interest rates may reduce, and as a result of which if he could get an opportunity to call back or to withdraw his issue or buy back rather the bonds from the market and then issue fresh instruments at a lower interest rate. This is called a call option. A call option is a choice, is a discretion which is vested in the holder of the option, which in this case is the issuer of the security, that he can buy back the instrument at a price which is predetermined. Now, the price at which the call option can be exercised would be mentioned in the contract of issue. You cannot on one fine morning get up and say, okay, I will buy back the bonds at this particular price. You have to specify it as part of the contract of issue that these bonds are involving or have an underlying call option embedded in them, whereby the issuer of the instrument can, on the terms which are specified in the contract of issue, recall the bonds from the market, so that he could substitute this debt by a cheaper debt at a later point in time if the market interest rates have changed to his benefit. So, that call option can be vested in the instrument of issue, in the contract of issue, and the terms on which the call can be exercised, particular the market price and the exercise price at which the call is to be exercised or may be exercised, as well as the timing at which the call can be exercised, or if there is one call or more calls attached to the bond, embedded with the bond, the timings at which the various calls can be exercised and the exercise price at which each such call can be exercised. All these things must be mentioned upfront at the time the bond issue is made. Now, how do we calculate the yield to call? Now, yield to maturity assumes that you are holding the bond to maturity, and thereby we work out the return on the, or the yield on the instrument. Now, when we work out the yield to call, the process is absolutely similar, but instead of using the redemption value and the term to maturity, what we use is the assumption that the call is exercised by the issuer of the bond. Assuming that the issuer of the bond exercises the call at the exercise price, and on the date of the point in time at which the call is exercisable, we work out a yield on the bond. That yield is called the yield to call. In other words, we substitute the redemption value of the bond and the term to maturity of the bond by the timing at which the call is to be exercised and the exercise price at which the call is exercised, and thereby we worked out a figure absolutely parallel or in absolutely similar manner using the same formula as the YTM, and that YTM which is returned is called the yield to call. In other words, putting it explicitly, the yield to call is the discount rate at which the future cash flows emanating from the bond, assuming that the call is exercised, equal the present market price of the bond. That is the important part, assuming that the call is exercised. So, we now do not hold the bond to maturity, we hold the bond up to the call date, and then we also use the price at which the call is exercisable by the issuer of the bond, and we work out a return. So, now in the case of the yield to first call, the expected cash flows on the coupon payments to the first call date and the call price etc. are used, as I mentioned just now. When a bond is callable, the practice has been to calculate a yield to call as well as a YTM, assuming that the call is not exercised. A callable bond may have a call schedule. I also mentioned just now that we can have a number of calls, say at t equal to 6 months, then at t equal to 1 year, and say at t equal to 2 years. We can have different calls at which points in time the issuer of the bond can call back the bonds at a price which is mentioned in the contract of issue. These prices may also be different. The exercise price of the call at t equal to 6 months may be different from that at 1 year, and so on. So, a callable bond may have a call schedule. A yield to call assumes that the issuer will call a bond on some assumed call date and the call price as the price specified in the call schedule. Typically, investors calculate a yield to first call and a yield to next call. The yield to first call is computed for an issue that is not currently callable, while the yield to next call is computed for an issue that is currently callable. In other words, the point in time at which the first call was made has expired, and therefore the bond is callable under the first call, but if it is not callable under the second call, and therefore we can work out the yield to next call instead of working out the yield to first call. Similar to the yield to call, we can work out the yield to put. What is the put option? Put option is a right to sell. So, if a bond is embedded with a put option that gives the investor that vests in the investor a right to sell the bond back to the issuer at a predetermined price on a predetermined date. The predetermined price again is the exercise price at which the investor can exercise the discretion, exercise the right to return the bond to the issuer, and the price at which the investor can sell the bond back to the issuer is the exercise price on the exercise of the put option. So, if the bond has a put option, then we can work out a yield to put option, yield to put on the same in the same manner as we work out the yield to call. That is, instead of using the maturity and the redemption value of the bond in the YTM formula, we use the point in time at which the exercise at which the put option can be exercised and the exercise price of the put option and work out the yield accordingly. Now, we come to clean and dirty price. Now, this is a very important concept. Let me explain it briefly. We shall take an example of this in the next lecture. What happens is, let us say today is t equal to 0, and today a particular bond has made a coupon payment, and now we move on in time, and the next coupon payment is say at t equal to 6 months. However, at t equal to 1 month or at any date, in any date between, let us call this point A, let us call this point B. At any time between point A and point B, you decide you are holding a particular bond, you have received a coupon payment at t equal to 0, that is at point A, but you keep on holding the bond, you do not sell it at point A. At a later point in time, let us say 15 days later, for example, 15 days later, 15 days, let us call this point C. At point C, you decide to sell the bond. The price that you will get, that is the question, or that is the issue that we want to address in this particular point. The interest that you are going to get at, or the whosoever is holding the bond is going to get at the point B, that is the next coupon payment, will comprise of two parts. The interest that belongs to you because you have held the bond for 15 days out of, let us say, the 182 days that remain between the two coupon bonds, and for the party who has bought the bond from you, who has held the bond for 182 minus 15, that is 167 days. So, this is the issue that we will address in the next lecture. Thank you.